A very warm welcome to this year's Gifford Lecture Series and a special welcome to our esteemed Gifford Lecturer for 2024, Professor Alexandra Walsham. So those of you here in the main venue or joining us online, watching live or perhaps later, I am delighted to have you join with us. You are joining together with a diverse group of people, with students, staff and attendees from the wider community in other parts of the country and abroad. You are very welcome indeed. My name is David Smith. I'm a professor here at the University of Edinburgh, Deputy Head of College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my privilege also to be convener of the Gifford Lectureship Committee. Before officially introducing our speaker and the first lecture in this series, please allow me to say a few words about our university and the Gifford Lectureship Series. Since welcoming its first students in 1583, the University of Edinburgh has played a pivotal role in shaping history, producing Nobel laureates, Olympic champions, pioneering scientists, and world leaders. It was here that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle found inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, and where James Young Simpson revolutionized medicine through his discovery of chloroform's anesthetic properties. More recently, theoretical physicist and emeritus professor Peter Higgs, who sadly passed away last year, was a Nobel Prize winner for physics, predicting the Higgs boson in 1964. The university's legacy in groundbreaking research, inspiring teaching and innovative thinking continues to attract exceptional minds from around the world. Among its many distinctions, the university is proud to have hosted the prestigious Gifford Lectures annually since 1888. These lectures were established through a bequest from Adam Lord Gifford, a justice of the Scottish Court of Session, whose vision was to advance the public understanding of natural theology, defined as the knowledge of God and the foundation of ethics or morals. The Gifford Lectures are held at each of the four older Scottish universities: Edinburgh, St Andrews, Glasgow and Aberdeen. They featured some of the most influential thinkers of our modern age. At Edinburgh, past lecturers have included William James, Henri Bergson, James G. Fraser, Albert Schweitzer, Reinhold Niebuhr, Iris Murdoch, Charles Taylor, Rowan Williams, and most recently, Dr. Cornel West. Our Gifford Lecturer for 2025 is a worthy member of this distinguished community, and I am delighted to introduce her today. Professor Alexandra Walsham is the 1930 Professor of Modern History and a Fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Cambridge. Her research centres on the religious and cultural history of early modern Britain, and she has published extensively in this field. Her books include The Reformation of the Landscape, Religion, Identity and Memory in Early Modern Britain and Ireland, for which she was joint winner of the Wolfson History Prize, and Generations, Age, Ancestry and Memory in the English Reformations, which arose from the Ford Lectures delivered at the University of Oxford in 2018. She's been a Fellow of the British Academy since 2009 and was appointed a CBE for services to history in 2017. She served as editor of the journal Past and Present for a decade and is currently president of the Historical Association. The 2025 Gifford Lectures will explore how mobility, both physical and emotional, shaped religious change, during the Reformation period. Focusing on the movement of people, ideas and emotions, Professor Walsham will examine how travel and internal transformation influence piety, ethics and politics in early modern Christianity, offering insight into the broader focus driving religious upheaval. In this lecture, Professor Walsham will establish a conceptual framework for the series by exploring early modern understandings of motion and emotion. She will examine their interconnection in religion, medicine, and natural philosophy, beginning with interpretations of earthquakes, moving to theories of the passions, and concluding with evolving views of divine action in the world and the emergence of natural theology. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Walsham to Edinburgh and to officially open the 2025 Gifford Lecture Series with her first lecture entitled Upheavals. Professor Walsham, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for such a generous introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Gifford Lectureship Committee and the University of Edinburgh for bestowing the honour of presenting these lectures this year upon me. I approach them with some trepidation, conscious of the many distinguished speakers who've preceded me, and the recitation we've just had of the role has strengthened that sense of trepidation. I very much hope that I shall do justice to Lord Gifford's vision. Mobility is intrinsic to the human condition. Movements give meaning to our lives and define who we are. They are a source of agency, identity, and power. In our globalized world, people, objects, organisms, and ideas travel through space and time at speed. The journeys they undertake help to establish networks, create opportunities, and forge relationships, but they also pose perennial problems and dilemmas for individuals and families, governments, and societies. They affect separation, inflame anxiety, and foment unrest. They are emblematic of the unsettlement and flux that's central to contemporary experience. If movement is sometimes synonymous with progress, modernity, and freedom, it's simultaneously associated with deviance, disorder, and danger. Whether voluntary or coerced, mobility provokes strong emotions. It incites feelings of compassion and pity, but it also engenders resentment, anger, and prejudice. It's both a consequence and a cause of the ideological, political, and social instability of our troubled times. The turbulence that surrounds us is mirrored by the turmoil that so many feel inside. In turn, this serves to stimulate movements of another kind. It catalyzes collective initiatives designed to transform the present and reshape the future, to eradicate racial inequality, to combat climate change, to prevent environmental degradation, to fight the damage wrought by social media, to protect vulnerable people, and to advance emotional well-being. We cannot ignore the dynamic role that religion continues to play in the making of history, the passionate beliefs that persist in inciting violence and igniting wars, but which also facilitate efforts to achieve consensus, solidarity, mutual understanding, and peace. The Gifford Lectures for 2025 are a series of variations on these resonant themes in the context of the profound theological, institutional, and cultural upheavals associated with the European Reformations and their ramifications further afield. They draw inspiration from the topicality of mobility as a subject of current commentary and controversy, but also from its rising profile as a field of interdisciplinary research in the humanities and social sciences, especially sociology and geography. This is now inspiring a new wave of historical studies. This coincides with a burgeoning scholarly interest in the history of emotions and with fresh investigation of what has been called the Reformation of feeling. Ranging across the period between 1500 and 1800, these lectures explore the piety, ethics, and politics of physical movement across landscapes, continents, and oceans, in tandem with the internal spiritual alterations that occurred within hearts and souls, bodies and minds. They focus on an era in which the mobility stimulated by religion was just one among many other factors contributing to instability, including extreme weather, hunger and poverty, outbreaks of epidemic disease, the growth of trade, commerce and colonization projects overseas, and new technologies of communication that enabled the faster circulation of information. Their geographical centre of gravity is the British Isles, but they open out in concentric circles to Europe and the wider world. I combine consideration of journeys and migrations with analysis of the internal conversions and convulsions experienced by self-conscious believers. I investigate the uprisings and commotions stirred up by people eager to halt and reverse reform, or to advance it further in accordance with their deeply held ideals. And I analyse a series of moments when individuals animated by intensely held convictions coalesced to take urgent action and to achieve radical spiritual and social goals. By probing the connections between motion and emotion in early modern Christianity, my lectures seek to illuminate larger questions about the origin, engines, and impact of religious change. They offer new insights into the potential of faith to bring about transformative inner effects and revolutionary external events in other times and places, including our own. In adopting movement as the framework for my investigation, I actively embrace the multivalency of this capacious word. In use in English and other European vernaculars from the 13th century, it was and is a term with many connotations. It denotes a change of location by a person or thing, and the action, manner, and mechanics of doing so. Linked with volition, it once meant an act of will and described a mental impulse or inclination, especially involving desire or aversion. Over time, it has acquired additional inflections. Since around 1800, it's been utilised to capture the idea of a tendency or trend, the direction in which conditions are moving at a particular time. In the related sense that developed concurrently, it refers to a course of action and endeavours by an alliance of people working towards a set of shared objectives and driven by a sense of mission. In this form, it's often accorded the honour of an initial capital. The Reformation itself has retrospectively been recognised and remembered as one such movement. These subtle transitions in meaning and usage reflect broader intellectual and cultural shifts, which form the backdrop to my inquiry. So too do the compelling linguistic and etymological links between the words motion and emotion. In the early modern era, they were frequently used interchangeably. They could mean a physical movement, a physiological function, an inward cogitation, and a spiritual sensation or feeling. They were applied both to the regular oscillations and unusual agitations of the earth and to episodes of civil unrest, public agitation, rebellion, and revolt. Traversing the blurred boundary between the literal and figurative, they're indicative of the close interrelationships between physics and metaphysics, natural philosophy and theology, body and spirit in contemporary thinking. In early modern discourse, people spoke of the motions and emotions of God, of the earth, and of the soul. They compared the activities of the deity and the perturbations of the terrestrial and celestial world with the affections and passions that disturbed and excited their hearts and minds. If the meaning of emotion has migrated more exclusively into the mental domain and become increasingly secularized in the centuries since, this is a measure of larger developments. It's an index of the gradual demarcation of what a previous Gifford lecturer, Peter Harrison, has called the territories of religion and science. It signals the separation of theology and morality from the task of explaining the workings of nature and the material world that's still dominant in the Western tradition. The rest of this lecture teases out some of these themes under the heading of upheavals. It proceeds in three parts: earth movements, soul movements, and regular motions. Earthquakes were the subject of much religious and philosophical discussion in the early modern period. Alongside storms, floods, comets, eclipses, strange apparitions in the sky, and monstrous births, they were perceived through the lens of inherited templates, including those supplied by the classical tradition and scripture. Matthew 27 tells how the earth shook, the rocks split, and tombs broke open during Christ's passion and death on the cross. The material world moved as if in sympathy with his suffering. In Luke 21, Jesus tells his disciples that earthquakes, war, famine, pestilence, and fearful sights in the heavens will multiply in the last days. The medieval tradition of enumerating such events as evidence that the end of the world was nigh was reinvigorated in 16th century Europe. The schism within Christendom fostered an atmosphere of apocalyptic expectation. A fascination with public calamities and portents developed on both sides of the emerging confessional divide and generated a science of eschatological science. In Lutheran Germany, earthquakes indexed feverish anticipation that the papal Antichrist would soon be vanquished. They were a constituent feature of wonder books and broadsides, as well as the Alsatian humanist Conrad Lycosthenes' comprehensive Encyclopedia of Prodigies, in which this woodcut illustration repeatedly appears. The Catholic Bishop of Vienna, Fredericus Nausea, was prompted by his experience of an earthquake at Mainz in 1528 to write an influential treatise on this topic, which he later expanded into 7 volumes. Similar reports and anthologies circulated in Italy, France, Switzerland, and England, feeding an appetite for international disaster news and reinforcing the widespread perception that these destructive events presaged doomsday and gave expression to divine wrath about human iniquity. Fed by reports sent to him by Heinrich Bullinger, Konrad Gessner, and others, the Zurich canon Johann Jakob Wick recorded many earthquakes in the multi-volume textual and visual chronicle he compiled between 1560 and 1588, as well as this terrible landslide which wiped out an entire village in 1564. Preachers and pamphleteers alike heralded these episodes as visible sermons that carried the heavy message of the Lord's anger against sin. They read them as providential warnings that all should repent lest a worse judgment befall them. This was the finger of God at work in the created world, the dramatic movements of which showed that he actively ruled the universe. The religious lessons that ministers and lay people drew from earthquakes coexisted with other explanations, including those drawn from Aristotelian meteorology. Absorbed into Christian scholasticism in the course of the Middle Ages, this explained them as the consequence of dry exhalations and vapours trapped in subterraneous cavities deep in the earth, which periodically erupted with volcanic force and wrought havoc on its surface. Aristotle explicitly compared these tremblings with the winds and colics that periodically afflicted the human body. The violent motions and emotions that this produced were their secondary causes. If a few spoke of earthquakes as miracles that occurred completely outside the order of nature, most reconciled geology with piety by recognizing the deity as the prime mover. This synthesis endured in 17th century divinity and natural philosophy, accommodating shifting scientific thinking about seismic activity. It's instructive to analyse how contemporary observers and eyewitnesses described and responded to particular earth movements. Some were local events like the landslip, which occurred at Muchmarcle in Herefordshire in 1571, when a large piece of ground roused itself out of a dead sleep and with a roaring noise removed from the place where it stood. It continued moving for 3 days, journeying down the slope of a hill, overturning sheep, hedgerows and trees, a chapel and 2 highways in the process, to the great amazement and fear of the beholders. Graphically depicted in this diagram, the miraculous moving and sinking of a 9-acre plot of ground at Westerham in Kent in 1596 was another strange and fearful sight that led to homiletic and moralistic commentary. Its reporter, John Chapman, declared incidents of this type were not to be attributed to either blind chance, casualty and fortune, or merely natural causes, but regarded as heedful documents which have their first, original and beginning of their motion in divine providence. Reminiscent of the swallowing of the biblical rebel Korah into the earth, this too was a warning designed to stir up dead and benumbed consciousness, to have some more lively feeling of the presence and power of God. The so-called Great Earthquake that occurred in southeast England in April 1580 was no more than a minor tremor, which lasted barely a minute. It shook buildings, toppled chimneys, cracked stonework, rattled crockery, and made bells ring and clamour of their own accord. An apprentice and maidservant were killed by falling masonry as they sat listening to a sermon in London. The aftershocks were felt in Oxford, Norwich, Antwerp, Rouen, and Calais. It too was seen as an extraordinary token of vengeance and a forerunner of greater punishments to come, including the removal of the candlestick of the gospel. Despite its negligible material effects, it was reported to have caused the hearts of those who felt it to shake and tremble. In its wake, the godly Protestant minister, Abraham Fleming, called for wise virgins to trim their lamps against the coming of the bridegroom, and told shameless Sabbath breakers, players, drunkards and swearers that they should themselves quake in terror at the impending apocalypse. Intertwining physical and emotional movement, the same rhetorical tropes continued to be reiterated throughout the 17th century. The author of an account of a very dreadful earthquake in the German city of Munster in 1612 wrote that the rocks, mountains and hills were ready to feel the general dissolution. He could not recall the ruins that resulted without weeping for the deplorable condition of my country, which were the blotted stories of its downfall. The English translation of a Dutch news pamphlet about this incident was emblazoned with the words, "Read and tremble." The flurry of ballads, books and broadsides prompted by earthquakes from Calabria to Coventry provoked similar meditations on widespread impiety and further prognostications of the Last Judgment. Preceded by an eerie calm, so did the small concussion that occurred in Northamptonshire in 1676, shaking houses and making a roaring and rumbling noise. Its anonymous gentleman reporter called for a serious and thorough reformation of abominations to divert God's displeasure, and declared that while the subordinate causes of these convulsive motions must be allowed, they should not jostle out the first. The tremor that occurred in Glasgow a few years later was accompanied by whirlwinds, thunder and lightning, causing the earth to heave and totter as if all nature had been oppressed with some ponderous pain. Notwithstanding the opinions of philosophers and astrologers, Christians should duly acknowledge a supernatural intendency from the divine prerogative. These commonplaces attest to a culture in which earthquakes were universally understood as empirical evidence of the existence of God, even as ideas about his precise methods of operation were both proliferating and slowly changing. The series of letters about small upheavals sent to the Royal Society in the second half of the century by its members attest to the pursuit of empirical evidence for these evolving theories, including the view that they were caused by underground explosions of flammable vapours and that they were less static events than a moving phenomenon that successively affected different locations. The absence of religious reflection in the accounts that appeared in the transactions should not deceive us. This was a self-denying ordinance of the Society, which occludes the continuing resilience of Christian interpretations of earth movements. What they reveal more clearly are how contemporaries experienced them. They tell how the earth was perceived to rock back and forth like a ship that's under sail, or as if one was in a coach or a cradle. They observe how the differing sensations felt by those standing, sitting, and lying, and their emotional impact. A certain Mrs. Allicock was so frightened that she expired within a few hours. Earthquakes could cause corresponding palpitations in human bodies. The reaction to the devastating earthquake that occurred in Port Royal, Jamaica, in early June 1692 offers further insight into both the persistence and evolution of contemporary assumptions. Seized from the Spanish in 1655, this maritime town, built upon a 10-mile-long spit of gravel and sand, rapidly grew to become the immensely wealthy commercial centre of Britain's Caribbean empire. It was not only renowned as the chief storehouse and treasury of the West Indies, it was also widely known as the Sodom of the New World. Densely populated with English and foreign merchants, privateers and colonists, it was a notorious hotbed of vice, filled with brothels, taverns and gaming houses. The huge earthquake that hit Port Royal destroyed hundreds of buildings. Half of the land under them sank into the harbour. Across the island, sugar plantations were likewise levelled. Around 2,000 people died, about a third of whom were enslaved Africans, some having been swallowed by the gaping chasms that opened up. Survivors described how the ground had rolled and moved under their feet as if it was liquid, the loud bellowing noise that lasted through its duration, and the raging seas that roared and boiled off the coast. In two frequently reprinted letters, the Anglican rector of the town, Emmanuel Heath, recalled how he knelt down in prayer and pleaded for mercy amidst all these motions and tremblings, setting out before those who joined him the heinous provocations that had brought this catastrophe upon them. He was also horrified by the looting, rifling, and robbery that ensued, which was a sad indictment of the godly, ungodly, debauched people who lived in the town. The wicked depravity and savagery of the audacious whores and rogues who roamed the streets would surely bring down further plagues upon the heads of the inhabitants. Reports and representations of this destructive event soon travelled north to Massachusetts and across the Atlantic to Europe. The Port Royal earthquake soon became the subject of sensational journalism and sermons that underscored the uncertainty and instability of sublunary things, the strength of the Almighty's wrath against sin, and the dangers of continuing to wallow in security and complacency. It stimulated natural philosophical discourse and was situated in a long line of other convulsions since antiquity that bore witness to the interventions of providence. The considerable impression that it left was intensified by the much smaller tremor with which it coincided in England and the Low Countries later that year. Jamaica's miseries were compared with London's mercies, but the latter's light chastisement was a compelling warning to profane scoffers who denied God's agency in disasters and wallowed in apathy, indifference, and the benumbing opium of atheism. This was the thrust of John Shower's practical reflections on earthquakes and of Samuel Doolittle's sermon address to a congregation in Reading. Doolittle's sermon recalled the words of Isaiah 2:19, with its warning to fear the Lord when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth on its title page. It compared these real earthquakes with the metaphorical turnings and overturnings, commotions and concussions that happened in the state and church, and urged its hearers and readers to learn from this visitation. He hoped that this and other earthquakes that turned the beautiful world into a confused chaos would make an heart quake in every impenitent sinner. Others took the opportunity to harness it to political and polemical agendas, including to endorse or criticise the recent revolution that had ejected the Catholic James II from the throne in favour of William and Mary. In Edinburgh, it inspired an unnamed minister of Christ to issue a tract entitled God's Voice to Christendom, or Alarm to Europe. This fiery diatribe was laced with apocalyptic anti-Catholicism and with Presbyterian contempt for the institution of episcopacy. A piece of covenanting polemic, it also insisted that the Bible suffers more abuse in Scotland nor any kingdom of the world. As the array of reactions to the yet more massive earthquake that destroyed Lisbon in 1755 reveals, motions and vibrations of the earth continued to be understood as proof that God's hand was not shortened and that he was no idle spectator. If it stimulated scientific debate about their origins and consequences and led some to doubt divine benevolence, it reinvigorated the faith of others and gave a fillip to the early evangelical initiatives of the Methodists John and Charles Wesley. Harking back to Port Royal and to the earthquake that destroyed Lima in Peru in 1746, in a sermon published a few years earlier, Charles Wesley had powerfully reiterated the view that God spoke to sinners in these subterranean thunders with the intention of compelling them to abandon their unbelief. When he makes the mountains tremble and the earth shake, shall not our hearts be moved? With these observations in mind, I turn next to the question of how people understood the internal movements that occurred in their hearts and souls, bodies and minds. The upheavals that took place in the macrocosm of the external world were mirrored by the emotions that they experienced inside. As historians of the affections and passions have shown, a holistic view of the relationship between soma and psyche, physiology and spirituality, reason and feeling prevailed in early modernity. Building on Aristotelian foundations, in the Galenic medical tradition, the sensitive soul was understood as an embodied phenomenon which was seated in the central organ of the heart. We now conceive of the soul as a mental and immaterial entity, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, its corporeal quality and bodily essence was not in question. The affections and passions produced actual alterations in the flesh. They unsettled and imbalanced the humours via impressions received from the senses and the vital animal spirits that travelled down from the brain to transmit information to the rest of the body. These motions or emotions of what was called the appetitive faculty were intricately linked with a person's inclination to good and evil. Regulating, taming, and moderating their unruly and inordinate movements was necessary to preserving one's mental, physical, and spiritual health. These were thorny briars, sprung from the infected root of original sin, which led human beings down the road to damnation, as the Jesuit Thomas Wright put it in his book on the passions of the mind. Those who gave up the reins of reason to sensual feeling and brutish affections placed their souls in the devil's power to be driven and dragged on uncontrollably to all wickedness. This process is strikingly depicted in an influential tract by the Neapolitan priest Lorenzo Scopoli entitled Il combattimento spirituale, spiritual conflict, which was translated into many European languages. By contrast, the frontispiece to the French Catholic Jean-François Senot's influential use of the passions shows them arraigned and enchained by the enthroned figure of reason. However, the passions could also serve as an inducement to virtue and lead a believer to deeper understanding of God's wisdom and providence. They were instruments of volition and will and an impetus to action. They could even transport one via raptures and ravishments of the soul to more intimate communion with one's Redeemer. In his study of the affections, subtitled The Soul's Pulse, William Fenner observed that they could serve as impediments to grace, but he also called them the feet, horses, and wings by which men and women were lifted up and brought closer to the Lord. In the words of the Dutch doctor Johann van Beverwijk, these movements of the heart, or the soul in its sensitive part, drew people to virtue and induced them to shun that which was evil. Writing in 1674, the physician William Charlton echoed these assessments, describing how the turbulent passions and violent fluctuations by which people were beset upset their temperaments and exposed them to disease. According to William Bulleen, perturbations of the spirits do change the state of the body marvellously and suddenly. At the same time, the affections were key to the divine art of acquiring tranquility of mind. Among other things, as Bettina Warwick has shown, music was thought to have the unique potential to soothe them, as this striking early 18th century German illustration of Psalm 33:15 reveals. Treatises on this topic straddled the boundaries between theology and moral and natural philosophy. Indeed, they illustrate their absolute inextricability in the integrated anthropology that characterized contemporary thinking. Movement was inherent in the model that Protestants and Catholics inherited from their medieval predecessors. As Richard Sargentson has commented, the study of the soul was a special branch of physics. And this spilled over into and shaped lived experience. Emotions like joy, hope, love, anger, hatred, envy, fear, and sadness were felt as forms of flux and flow. They manifested themselves in the outward complexion, gestures, and actions of those who suffered and were subject to them, above all in the expansion and contraction of the heart. They changed their temperature, reddened and leached colour from their faces, caused them to swell, sweat, and moan, and made people become physically agitated. In short, they gave them the shakes. This is the intellectual context in which we must understand the physiological and emotional effects felt by those who were caught up in the earthquakes I discussed earlier. It explains why the clergy spoke of internal, spiritual earthquakes as the motions of the soul. The language they employed was not simply metaphorical. It accurately captured what they believed was happening inside and outside their bodies. In turn, they used the same vocabulary to describe how the earth moved. This fitted naturally with their anthropocentric conception of the universe and cosmos. In the course of the early modern period, the humoral theory of emotions was challenged by alternative conceptions of how the body worked in relation to the mind and the soul. Delineated in his book, The Motions of the Heart of 1628, William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood was one development that contributed to unsettling the foundations of traditional thought in this area. Another was René Descartes' own assessment of the body as a complex machine. This and other interventions precipitated the beginnings of a shift from a heart-centered to a brain-centered notion of the emotions, from a cardiocentric to a craniocentric vision of the self. The Cartesian dualism that was the lasting legacy of these epistemological developments, and which we have internalized, has obscured the extent to which traditional assumptions about the affections derived from Aristotle's De Anima remained influential well into the 19th century, even as new anatomical discoveries, chemical theories, and notions of the nervous system emerged. The stark contrast between the material and spiritual realms and the disembodiment of the soul was softened by a continuing tendency to think of it as an organic entity propelled by the emotions. Nor did the mechanical universe that was coming into being banish God from playing a part in the inner drama enacted by the human passions. There was no inherent incompatibility between the idea of divine sovereignty and the idea of the body as a set of levers, springs, pipes, and vessels directed from the brain rather than the heart. The reconfiguration of the soul as a cognitive agent and the secularization of the emotions were both very slow processes. So too was the genesis of the still lingering presupposition that emotional detachment is a necessary prerequisite for rational scientific inquiry. What then were the links between emotion and devotion in the early modern world? Revolving around remembrance of the bodily passion of Christ and the vicarious sufferings of his mother Mary, the intensely emotional spirituality nurtured by medieval Catholicism provoked suspicion in Protestant circles. So did the religious culture of relic veneration and the copious holy weeping of figures like the East Anglian mystic Margery Kempe. The reformers repudiated these practices as superstitious and idolatrous, criticising the carnality of those who indulged in them. After some initial hesitations born of humanist caution, the Counter-Reformation eagerly re-embraced the affections and brandished sensuous varieties of worship and piety as a weapon against heresy. It cultivated forms of affective devotion in which emotion was understood not as the Stoics saw it, as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a route to deeper knowledge of God and of the meaning of the motions inside one's own soul. Devotion to the Sacred Heart became a hallmark of post-Tridentine piety. Bernini's famous sculpture of the Spanish visionary Teresa of Avila gives expression to the ecstasies that helped her to achieve canonization. But in convents across Europe, similar experiences shaped how female religious led their lives. In the exiled communities of English Benedictine and Carmelite nuns that sprang up in the Low Countries, the control and cultivation of emotions were two sides of the same coin. Intrusive and unruly, passions were dangerous obstacles to divine union, which required mortification. Turmoil in the heart could be a barrier to the deep state of contemplation for which they strove. The impulses and impetuosities of nature to which people were subject stood in the way of true devotion. On the other hand, feelings allured the soul to intimate acquaintance with the Holy Spirit. At Cambrai, Gertrude Moore yearned for these to flow and quench her thirst for Jesus Christ, while Margaret Gascoigne wrote of her longing for him in intoxicating and even erotic terms. She prayed that she would be possessed by the sweet violence of his love and hoped that God would excite in her bowel and kindle in her heart most ardent desires. These were sentiments that made some Protestants squirm. Yet as much recent revisionist work has taught us, the repudiation of the Reformation as austere, stoical, and cerebral has been gravely overstated. Protestantism, too, was a feeling faith. The public and private piety of zealous Calvinists in Northern Europe, intent upon finding evidence that they numbered among the elect, was no less kinetic, dynamic, and restless. In their daily lives, to quote Alec Ryrie, emotion was an elemental spiritual force, as irresistible as hunger or gravity. It was a source of revelation and a precious gift from God. It was one of the hallmarks of the experimental predestinarianism practiced by Puritans and the members of gathered churches and congregations. The fervour of these visible saints found expression in powerful affections, which were also the key to discerning their own spiritual destiny and to gaining assurance of their fate in the next life. Devout believers were often pitched from joy and happiness to a sense of deep despair that sometimes nurtured suicidal thoughts. If they were tossed and turned by temptations and assaulted by sharp pricks of conscience, they were also overcome by intense desires that manifested themselves in pleasure and zeal. Their spirits were quite literally uplifted by the knowledge that they might be one of the saved. As the Cambridge divine William Perkins observed, it is a property of them that do indeed believe to judge their estate by feeling. The process of religious awakening, a later minister wrote, was invariably accompanied by some great and remarkable impression and alteration made on the whole heart. Externally, this could take the form of sighing, groaning, sobbing, and weeping, a sad agony for which many actively yearned. Similar tendencies were a feature of the effective spiritualities that flourished among the mid-17th century sects and that later found expression in pietism, which spread from Germany and Switzerland to Scandinavia in the late 17th and 18th centuries. This evangelical movement within Lutheranism has been described as cultivating religious feeling, almost as an end in itself. Internal motion thus marked out those chose to receive divine grace. By contrast, the lot of the reprobate was spiritual and emotional inertia. The languid indifference of sleepy 16th and 17th century Christians was reminiscent of the lukewarm church of Laodicea, which God had spewed out of his mouth. The hearts of those hardened by sin were by definition lacking signs of vitality. They were stony, frozen, dead, and cold. English Puritans often worried that their own drowsy piety might signify damnation, and dry and flinty affections might be a mark of hypocrisy. They welcomed afflictions and tribulations as a test of sincerity and a mechanism for melting the ice that was crystallizing inside them, for reversing a kind of spiritual hypothermia. The humoral vocabulary they used highlights the abiding fear of the godly, that they might be one of those doomed to feel no movement at all in their souls. All of this explains why early modern preachers on both sides of the confessional divide actively strove to stir up the affections of their hearers. Guides on how to preach urged the clergy to use pithy, forcible, and loving exhortations in combination with appropriate bodily gestures that would touch the hearts of their auditors and open the shutters of the soul to the Holy Spirit. Sermons in this mode were designed to be pathetical, affectionate, and moving. In accordance with ancient rhetorical tradition, they were exercises in the art of stirring the emotions, from laughter and joy to grief and remorse. Protestants frequently criticised the emotional preaching of their Catholic rivals as mere spectacle and show, but they too sought to pull on the heartstrings of their auditors. Mimicking the emotions of spirit that Jonah had demonstrated in his denunciation of the city of Nineveh, this was the style of preaching that many divines adopted in the wake of natural disasters. Their aim was to bring hearers to a true understanding of the need for repentance. Tellingly, the Greek word for repentance is metanoia, which means change of heart. In a sermon on this subject preached in the wake of a minor tremor in 1607, George Meryton declared that the hearts of sinners must suffer an earthquake within them and tremble and rend. The Scottish Presbyterian Robert Bruce was said to have made always an earthquake upon his hearers and to have rarely preached but to a weeping auditory. The first public communion he celebrated in Edinburgh in 1588 was likewise accompanied by an extraordinary effusion of the Spirit. The godly sorrow for which these and other ministers called was a sentiment that touched, softened, and thawed their hearts, and that manifested itself in an outflowing of tears. If these were counterfeit or crocodile tears, the Lord's justifiable anger would be provoked rather than slaked. While God was understood as a mysterious being, without body, parts, or passions of his own, it was commonplace to speak as if he had emotions himself. In short, unless people felt and followed the motions in their souls, they could not hope to lift the sword of vengeance that hovered over their heads. Effective penitential preaching in this prophetic mode persisted into the later 17th century. Its continuing currency in the aftermath of public calamities is compellingly attested by a sermon on evangelical repentance delivered by the London pastor Thomas Beverley in 1692, following the Port Royal earthquake and the smaller monetary motion in the southeast of England that autumn. This was an extended discourse on godly sorrow as a natural passion sanctified by God. It worked on the matter and frame of the body, he said, after the manner of a broken bone or bruised flesh. Repentance was accompanied by real trembling and by affectionate emotions of the soul. The recent frightful motions of the earth in Jamaica and the more gentle and tender trepidation felt at home were not only a call for national conversion, but a token of the impending apocalyptic fall of the whole papal and anti-Christian state of Rome. Beverley's sermon on the movements of that mighty vessel, the soul, reflects the vitality of the view that the Almighty actively intervened in the world to punish sin and admonish reform. But in other circles, opinion was gradually shifting. God was beginning to be conceptualized less as an unpredictable and vengeful Jehovah, and more as a benevolent and merciful creature who rarely interrupted the regular course of nature. Perceptions of his emotional temperament were subtly changing. A corresponding alteration in sensibility saw a retreat from the highly emotional style of spirituality that had been prevalent in earlier decades, which some dismissed as religious enthusiasm. Greater emphasis was coming to be placed on governing the unruly passions by reason. These observations serve as a link to the final and brief section of this lecture, which explores some of the intellectual trends that energized and unsettled Christian society in the early modern era. Natural philosophers had always understood the objective of their endeavors as a demonstration of God's wonderful workmanship of the world. As the French Calvinist Lambert Dano articulated in his influential treatise on this topic, nature was a looking glass or mirror in which his omniscience and glory was reflected. The same tenet underpinned the Christian neo-scholasticism of the Wittenberg reformer Philip Melanchthon. It was conventional to present nature as a second book alongside the Bible. The motions that occurred within the earth, the sea, the sky, and the human body all set forth God's wisdom and power. Paralleling the motion of the soul towards celestial bliss, they demonstrated the perfection and immutability of the deity who'd made this extraordinary orb. Heaven itself was an immaterial place that was eternal and free of mutation. Investigation of secondary causes was entirely compatible with Christian faith. There was no inherent tension between natural philosophy and theology, both of which were part of the quest to comprehend divine majesty. The idea that the scientific revolution was an agent of disenchantment has been thoroughly repudiated in recent decades. Claims that new discoveries and developments fundamentally challenged piety and precipitated an enduring split between science and religion have been convincingly questioned. In their place, a more complex picture has emerged. Published in his The Revolution of the Celestial Spheres of 1543, the findings of the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus unsettled traditional assumptions about the centrality of a stationary Earth, around which other heavenly bodies revolved, replacing them with a new model in which it rotated about the sun and spun on its own axis. This certainly stirred controversy, not least because it appeared to contradict Scripture. Luther and others dismissed it as a vain invention and fond imagination, the empirical demonstration of the Earth's mobility provided by Galileo famously led to his trial for heresy. Yet he neither sought nor desired to expel God from the universe, nor did the novel philosophies of nature developed by René Descartes and Pierre Gassendi, despite the contemporary perception that they were instrumental in the spread of atheism. Reconceptualizing the physical world as a well-oiled cosmic machine did not mean rejecting the presence of the divine prime mover, though it did raise questions about the circumstances in which the deity needed to intervene to maintain it. The movements of the clock of the universe were not autonomous, and its operations were themselves evidence of his sovereignty. The science of Isaac Newton was likewise entirely compatible with the idea that God ruled the world, uncovering the mathematical laws of motion that underpinned how matter behaved was a way of demonstrating this. This is the backdrop against which we should set the development of physico-theology, a word which was first used adjectively in English by Walter Charlton in a book entitled The Darkness of Atheism, published in 1652. Embracing and incorporating the empirical developments I've discussed, physico-theology sought to provide arguments for the existence of God and his role in designing the physical, botanical, and zoological world for the benefit of humankind. Diverting their gaze from Holy Writ to the realm of nature, its practitioners found ample proof of the transcendent and infinite godness of providence. John Ray's Wisdom of God was the centerpiece of this emerging epistemological tradition. Based on a series of lectures delivered while he was a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, this treatise exhaustively investigated the visible works of creation, from the elements, meteors, and planets to fossils, vegetables, and animals, as signatures of the presence of an intelligent architect and of his ongoing care and superintendence of the universe. It was an extended commentary on Psalm 104:24. How manifold are thy works, O Lord! In wisdom hast thou made them all. It saw the minutiae of life as evidence of his footsteps, rather than the product of a fortuitous clash of free-floating atoms or the automatic actions of a self-propelling machine. Ray presented the motions of heavenly entities and of the creatures with which the Lord had peopled the terrestrial earth as effectual evidence to convince all who denied or doubted this. Everything from gravity and the circulation of the blood to the smallest blade of grass and ear of corn, he argued, should stir us up and increase in us affections and habits of admiration, humility, and gratitude. Ray's book also took the opportunity to dispute some of the conclusions of Thomas Burnet's sacred theory of the earth, notably the claim that mountains were deformities and warts that demonstrated the degenerate state of the post-Edenic world and bore witness to the deluge, insisting instead that they too evinced God's beneficence and ingenuity. In a further work published the following year, and reissued under the title of 3 physico-theological treatises in 1693, Ray developed his critique of Burnet further by suggesting that these and other distinctive features of the landscape were generated by earthquakes, like the one that had just occurred at Port Royal in Jamaica, and the lesser concussion that had subsequently shaken Northern Europe. The emotions of subterranean vapours that produced such topographical features were themselves instruments of divine will, not only in serving as the source of rivers and springs, metals and minerals, but also in affording pleasant and delightful prospects to all who beheld them. They did not presage the dissolution of the world so much as demonstrate God's foresight in anticipating every single need of his creatures. This anthropocentric vision was intended to promote comfort rather than fear. These themes featured prominently in the lectures in natural theology that Robert Boyle established to confute the folly of infidelity and the danger of atheism, the first of which were delivered by Richard Bentley, chaplain to the Bishop of Worcester in 1692. In keeping with Newtonian physics, Bentley centred his attention on the mechanical motion of matter, in keeping with Newtonian physics. Others scrutinised the intricacies of plants and animals with the aid of the microscope. In the 16 sermons that comprised his contribution to this series, published in 1713 as Physico-Theology, William Derham surveyed the stupendous works of the terraqueous globe, including grottos, volcanoes and caves, before turning to animals, birds and reptiles, whose locomotive faculty of moving from place to place by legs and wings he heralded as a special demonstration of God's foresight. Only God could have contrived so curious a set of limbs, joints, bones, muscles and nerves to facilitate their commodious motion. This reached the height of perfection in the physiology of man, who walked upright on 2 feet for the security of his heart and brain, the seats of the sensitive and rational soul. The erect posture of human beings signified their dominion over other creatures. Frequently republished and translated into other vernaculars, including French, German and Dutch, the works of Ray and Derham were among the bestsellers of the period. Physico-theology spread across Protestant Europe between 1650 and 1760, acquiring different inflections in the varying national and confessional environments in which it was diffused. It reached a broad audience and even filtered into the culture of ordinary people. In the mid-18th century, a Dutch wool carder turned his living room into a working model of the motions of the universe. The goal of illustrating God's presence and moral purposes by probing the workings of the natural world remained a high intellectual priority and an influential trend, inspiring the work of William Paley, whose Natural Theology of 1802 compared God with a watchmaker and served as a stimulus for later initiatives. Among these, of course, were the lectures in the 4 ancient Scottish universities of St Andrews, Aberdeen, Glasgow and Edinburgh, established by the will of Adam Lord Gifford in 1887, to promote and diffuse the study of natural theology in the widest sense of the term. In other words, the knowledge of God. In focusing on religious mobility in its multiple forms, physical and metaphysical, metaphorical and literal, the rest of my lectures take advantage of the broad remit envisaged by Lord Gifford. This one has probed the meaning that early modern Christians accorded to dramatic and catastrophic movements of the earth, and the passions and emotions that they felt inside their hearts and souls, in conjunction with the regular operations that many came to see as telling evidence of God's very existence and benevolent government of his created world. If this was an anthropocentric and theocentric vision, it was also a cosmology predicated on the precept that human behaviour had direct consequences in the terrestrial world. The upheavals of the earth reflected and felt the misdemeanours of the people that populated it. Its motions signalled God's grief as sin and forewarned of heavier judgments to come. Its distress was a symbol of the moral condition of those who had stewardship over it. And this is an insight that has enduring relevance for our own times. In my next lecture, I take up the equally capacious theme of journeys. I investigate the significance of spiritual travel across space and time, alongside the moral and social anxieties provoked by people who were perpetually on the move. Thank you.
Professor Walsham, Alex, thank you so much for the motion of your lecture and the emotion that we have experienced as we have been so stimulated by it. Thank you so much indeed. You have given us much to think about and absolutely, I think, would say whet our appetite for all that you have in store for us over the next 5 lectures. So thank you very much indeed. We have an opportunity now. We have some time for questions and answers. So Louise is standing by. Louise is over here with the microphone. She'll bring it to you. If I could ask, please, when you ask your question, please wait for the microphone to arrive, and then those who are joining us online will be able to also hear as well as here in the room. So please, any questions for Professor Walsham? Yes, gentleman over here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and it's a huge, wide range of different things. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. I'm sure. I'm looking forward to the rest of the lectures. I wanted to ask about the sort of human ability to move the landscape, and this came into my mind when you mentioned the story of, is it Kor? It's one of the rebels against Moses and Aaron in the Old Testament. He and his friends get swallowed up by the earth. And I remembered coming across this because Archbishop von Bar's curse against the Border Reivers in 1525, which was read out in all the churches of Teviotdale about how, what is going to happen to the Border Reivers, actually invokes that passage and I think commands the earth to open up and swallow up the Border Reivers. History doesn't recall whether they did, but in 1525, a Catholic archbishop does seem to think that he can command the earth to open up and swallow up wrongdoers. And does that fit anywhere in this scheme of things?
Well, that's an interesting example, isn't it? Of course, one of the emphasis that emerged after the Reformation was that actually human beings can't perform, miracles of that kind, and that it is concentrated in the figure of God. So post-Reformation providentialism gives greater sovereignty and omnipotence to God. But clearly there are moments when preachers like to invoke those sorts of sets of assumptions, and when they think of themselves as kind of emotionally driven instruments of God. So I think that's a kind of perhaps a rhetorical move, but in the spirit of what I've been saying, the metaphorical and the literal are very closely intertwined frequently across this period. Yeah.
Thank you very much. More questions? Just please, just here.
Thank you for the lecture. When people were arguing using these natural movements as examples for their point, was there any examples where people on different sides of the theological divide would use the same event,
yes,
but argue for themselves? How common was that, you found?
Yes, very common indeed. And each side of the kind of confessional divide and across the confessional spectrum are harnessing these events in ways that are seeking to prove the truth of their position. And the ironic consequences of that is that unsettles and destabilizes that concept of truth. People harnessing these events for their own ends helps to promote pluralization, to unsettle people's assumptions about the world. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Any more questions, please? Yes, just here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm looking forward to the rest of the journey. Just a quick comment about the Psalms and emotion, because Calvin, in his preface to the Psalms, I can't remember the exact quote, but he says something like, the Psalms hold up a mirror to every human emotion that there is. And it seems to me that the the fascination of singing the Psalms is not only about sort of singing God's words to God, but kind of engaging with that emotion. And listening to your lecture, I also began to think about the way the Psalms talk about nature, the hills clapping their hands or whatever. And I was wondering if there was a similar, there is in a way coming through from use of the Psalms across the confessional divide again, there is a similar link of emotion and motion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know that psalm singing is the kind of secret weapon of the Reformation. It's an immensely powerful instrument for stirring up emotion. And, that definitely speaks to these questions that I've been exploring. Psalm singing, follows and is linked with these disasters themselves. So that interplay between the language of Scripture, the motions that are taking place, and the emotions that people are feeling, is tremendously powerful in the period.
I'll join the thank yous. Thank you. It was wonderful. And it's hard to ask a question because I don't want to anticipate something you're going to talk about later, so feel free to reject my questions. But I was thinking about your comment about the visible sermon in the 16th century broadsides, and I was thinking about Robert Boyle, who came up in his occasional meditations, whose aim is, at least in part, to teach you how to interpret the acts of the world through a kind of a religious lens. And I was thinking about these visible sermons and the claim of it, and I was wondering if you could talk some about whose task it was to teach people to read the visible sermons in the 16th century, or if you know about that. And if you're going to talk about it, don't talk about it today.
No, that's not going to come up later. But and I think, in the sort of vein of what I've just been saying earlier about the fact of the rupture within Christendom, creating multiple communities of faith which each claim to be the single embodiment of truth. Those questions about interpretation of what's happening inside the soul, what's happening in the earth, become polemicized and politicized in complex ways. And there's a sort of question of who and how you should interpret these events therefore becomes increasingly important. Not least against the backdrop of the intellectual changes that I've been describing, which themselves promote allegations of atheism, of falsehood, of untruth. So it becomes a tremendously important issue.
Please.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. Can I ask whether collection, the assemblage of natural artifacts, should be seen at least partly as a spiritual exercise rather than as a kind of an expression of an Enlightenment rationalism?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the tenor of what I've been saying, in common with many other scholars, is that those divides between Enlightenment and Reformation piety are not helpful ones, and that the collection of evidence of all kinds, from earthquakes to microscopic analysis of the human body, to collection of fossils or other objects, is indeed an act of piety. The culture of collecting is deeply infused with these convictions about natural theology. Yeah.
I was wondering, listening to the music of your voice, and I do want not only to thank you for the wonderful work you have done in the lecture, but to say that your delivery of it was in itself an act of poetry for us. and thinking then of poetry, and thinking that in the end of the 16th century, audiences would also have been listening to Julius Caesar, Act 2, Scene 1, Scene 2, and indeed slightly before it, the evidence of natural disasters variously interpreted, differently of course in Julius Caesar, by Cicero, by Cassius, and by Calpurnia most of all. When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. Now, an audience would be hearing that and would be hearing some of the phenomena you are speaking about at the end of the 16th century. How do you think, would these things be hostile to one another, or would they draw together and, in a sense, seem to confirm one another?
I think that, you know, the theatre, the poetry, the literature of the period is echoing, you know, the assumptions that I've been describing. I mean, in many ways, the language I've used and that contemporaries use to describe these events is a theatrical and dramatic language, isn't it? And I think that those two things are, you know, that the interface between the you know, the acted and the real is porous in this period. So I think that those two things have to be understood alongside each other. But equally, a theatre creates a culture of pretense, yeah, which might also, in some ways, then raise questions about, you know, the veracity of events in the wider world as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Please.
Thank you again from me. Just a very simple question really is about where the distinction between a natural disaster and a human disaster might be drawn. Now, I was thinking of 1666 and the fire of London, and I can't remember what Defoe writes about that, but when do they, when does the human intervene here?
Yes. That's a really good question. Of course, there can be multiple perceptions of these events that contradict each other, but the human role in disaster is always as an instrument of divine will. But I think I'd point to another aspect of this that I was alluding to at the very end, and that is, it's not simply human behavior, people lighting fires or accidentally burning something that sets off a fire or whatever it is, but it's also that very powerful sense they have that it's human behavior that has consequences in the environmental world. So, you know, that kind of notion of an anthropogenic universe is almost there in this period already, in this moralistic and theological and providential sense that I've been describing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. You described the citation of animals and their movement in some of the reasoning around this. Does that suggest that, I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about how they viewed animal emotions, because from a modern perspective we would say animals are capable of motion and emotion. And so did they have a different view of animal emotion that allowed them to separate humans from animals?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. They do think of the animal as having emotions or passions, but the animal does not have a human soul. And that's the fundamental issue. So as I described earlier, the passions are unruly things. And it's the capacity of reason to shape that differentiates the animal and the human. But it's very intriguing that I think in so many ways, some of the insights that are kind of emerging in recent inquiry are anticipated in curious ways by the cosmology of the period I've been describing.
Yes, please.
Thank you, that was truly fascinating. Could I ask a question similar to that, but from the other end of the scale, which is about angels and their motion and emotion, and also how the role of angels is changing with their kind of role in cosmological change of planets, and also theories about motion, but then the later trends you were talking about.
Thank you. I think that's a subject on which I'll need to do more work than I have to date. But I think it's important to recognize how complex and fluid their conceptions of other spirits are. And here, perhaps going to the other side of the divide, the devil and demonic spirits are thought of as having the kind of powers of a natural magician, that they're able to manipulate nature in ways that are deceptive to the human senses. And of course, devils are often perceived to be angels clothed in the garments of light. So those questions about how movements that one might see in one's soul, actually, but also outside in the external world, where they come from and where those impulses emerge from, and what motions one is experiencing are extremely fraught with anxiety in this period. There's long been a tradition of the discernment of spirits, but in many ways that's intensified and complicated by the religious ruptures of the period. And once again, it becomes harnessed to competing battles about what is true and what is false. So I think that's where the motions, the movements of spirits come into play.
Just here, and then...
Thank you for your broad introduction. What's really intriguing me just now is to diffuse the study of natural theology. Because so often, since the Gifford Lecture started, people have become more particular, more in their own, either it be scientific explanation or it'll be through charismatic movements. So what's coming to mind here is it's through the centre seems to keep changing in society. So you get movement to the left or movement to the right, whether it be in theological understanding or in how we live, which is very much the knowledge of God. And there's this imbalance between the two sides, as you just said, and this mystical way, and then the other rational. So finding this middle, when there's so much movement changing, and what came to mind too is post-traumatic stress disorder that we now know about. So often it might not be seen at the time, this movement within, but actually it comes out, whether in a society or individual, it can come out in very weird ways.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure I have anything to add to that, except that it's very interesting observation. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. I was very struck that a lot of the learned sermons that you referred to drew on ancient psalms. During this period, were psalms seen as ancient Jewish wisdom, or were they seen as just part of the Christian Bible?
Very much the latter, yes, very much part of the Christian tradition. I suppose it's worth saying that, of course, in many ways, the Protestant side of the Reformation sees a very vigorous return to the Old Testament in general, and to a sense among Protestants that they are a new Israel, and that those books of the Bible, those languages of emotion of Israel, are very, very powerfully invoked across the period. And as we'll see, that continues to be the case across multiple forms of movement that I'm going to describe.
I think that will be the final question just over here, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking journey through a lot of material that I'm going to have to think about a lot more after this. But I was quite intrigued by something that you said about another kind of movement, this shift from thinking about God in terms of a vengeful Jehovah to, I can't remember the exact words used, but I think you said a gentler creature. It's axiomatic in most Catholic and Protestant theology, surely, that God is not a creature. As the creator, he can't be part of his creation. But if people were thinking of him in creaturely terms, that would imply a very different kind of relationship to the rest of creation and to his intervention in creation. And I was just wondering if that is a shift in thinking about God's nature that's happening at this time. If you could say a little bit more about that kind of thought and who's thinking it.
I think you might have slightly misheard me. I think they didn't use the word creature,
right, okay,
actually.
Must have misheard, right.
They thought of him as a more benevolent creator.
Oh, creator, right,
yeah,
okay.
Creator. And I think that is nevertheless, a really important sort of shift in the dial around the late 17th century. Some of those arguments, really clearly exhibited in the sort of discourses around earthquakes as divine judgments, are beginning to shift. The sort of tectonic plates, if you like, are shifting, pardon the pun. And that itself is symptomatic of kind of a complicated set of intellectual and cultural developments that are themselves linked with shifts in sensibility and emotional climate. So not creature, but certainly a God who operates in different ways and who simultaneously is operating less in an interventionist fashion and more in the fashion of someone looking down upon this clock that he's created.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Walsham, for such a stimulating start to this series, and I think that was evident in the wide-ranging number of questions that we just had. So please join me in thanking Professor Walsham. Thank you. Well, we've had such a wonderful evening together, and it is not my job to detain you any further. So please, if you would lend me 1 minute of your time, I do have a few other brief thank yous to give before we depart. So would like to thank our venue hosts, to those of you who asked questions, and as I said, such a wide-ranging mix of questions, to the Gifford Lectureship Committee, to Professor Jay Brown, who unfortunately is unable to be with us this evening, to Professor Alvin Jackson, thank you, to Louise Kelly, and for all who have supported in this series, a huge thank you to you all. To you for attending, to you for watching, and for you all for engaging with your questions and both with your minds and your reflection. To all of those behind the scenes for your support in making this event a success, and to those of you on the AV desk at the back, to Glowcast, thank you very much indeed. So hope to see you at tomorrow's lecture. This has again whet our appetite, and we very much look forward to being back with you tomorrow. If you are unable to attend in person tomorrow, please do keep in mind that you can join online via YouTube, or you can watch again later on. So can I have one final rousing round of applause, please, for our speaker, Professor Alexandra Walsham.